Language and mind. This topic is like the chicken and egg question, which came first? Did we learn to think before we speak? Or did language shape our thoughts? In this section, we look at the various theories and the relationship of language and thought. Many people consider that upon introspection, we seem to think in the language we speak. It's a common misconception that what we think is what we really speak. Thinking and expressing are closely related, though they have their own difference. It is important that the differences between different forms of communication are discussed in relation to the neural paths of development. In addition, it is also important that we try to understand the basis behind how the mind is directly connected to language. In further topics, we will study about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and theory of linguistic relativity. Famous researchers even say that infants are born with a language-independent processing system. It is also observed that language can act as a cultural entity to identify an ethnic group. The various studies conducted on the development of languages reveals that infants develop the sense of language only after the age of 2. So, how do they communicate before that? Is it a simple or more complicated form? Language is not a cognitive function, but also the only source of conveying what one thinks and what one intends to say to another person. Have you ever wondered how kids start understanding what the adults say to them? Theory and associated hypothesis. It's a general notion that the reality projected through spoken words is synchronous with the thought perception process. Perceiving and expressing are considered to same, and it is preconceived that what we speak is formulated on our thoughts. According to the notion, the basic presumption is what we speak is dependent on how it is inscribed or decrypted in our minds. On the other hand, it is believed that what we perceive depends on what we speak. In short, this group believes that thought depends on language. Famous linguist Edward Sapir had formulated a theory of linguistic relativity, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that occupies great importance in the field of communication. This theory satisfies criteria that are essential to identify its workability. This theory holds that one's language helps in forming one's view on reality. This theory represents language and spoken words in terms of which thought category it falls under. This theory of linguistic relativity holds that the thought arises from language and what we see is based on what we say. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is split into two categories: linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. The former part refers to what is said has very minimal effects on how concepts are understood. The fundamental concept has been split into strong and weak determinism. The term strong determinism refers to an orthodox view that what a person speaks is accountable for what is perceived by the mind. In a famous experiment, deaf children see a doll kept in a marble box. The children observe that the marble is removed and placed in another basket after the doll was removed. The deaf kids are asked to trust that the doll will look into the box for the marble after it comes back. Surprisingly, the deaf kids with deaf parents responded positively to this experiment, and the deaf kids with non-deaf parents responded incorrectly. This study has portrayed the connection between the deaf children and their deaf parents who communicate through complex sign language, and their attempt to respond correctly to the situation given to them. The children here have been brought up in the sign language environment, easily identified that the doll would look into the box. On the other hand, children who grew up with normal parents weren't able to identify because the parents were not well versed with sign language and could not communicate the same to their children. The alternate view, weak determinism, recognizes that there is some impact on the perception of one's language, but the concept is not as clear as strong determinism. This concept does not describe one's view of the world. The second part of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is linguistic relativism. As a world-renowned fact, human beings do not live alone in the world and are dependent on the society for their basic needs. Thus, for humans, language is used as a medium for expression to convey their ideas and thoughts. Language and thought. Language and thought process share a subtle connection. Our everyday lives center on the usage of a language without which communicating to others and trying to understand what they say would be futile. Language is basically used to converse, understand what another person says, and to process information to arrive at logical inferences. Rational thinking and logical processing requires use of language. Some researchers such as Sapir and Whorf propose that thought is totally determined by the language. Just imagine a world without language. How would technology advance and create a revolution? Language has become such an integral part of our lives that even the smallest task would require us to communicate to another person using a language. All the above factors seem to bind the thought process and the use of language in the world today. The other dimension of thinking included the subvocal speech. The attempt to solve a problem or process something internally requires an inner language. Talking to oneself is a common sight when people face bad times or challenges in the most stressful conditions. The most common view of a classroom reveals that 90% of the children vocalize what they have been taught in class by talking to themselves or to others. Children resort to this technique not because they would want to store their thoughts in form of language, but to only vocalize their thoughts and ideas. Some linguists and researchers state that the language and thought are entirely two different and independent entities. The variations in the syntax structure and in the various dictionaries available in multiple languages cannot possibly identify the way people think and perceive. According to the various statements made in the above paragraphs, thoughts come first, followed by a person's language as a tool for thought expression. According to some scientists, like as Brunner, language and thought are entirely different entities. He had proposed three ways in which a kid remembers and uses the information from the environmental around him. The three ways are through lively representation or using physical means by using objects to demonstrate one's thoughts, by helping the child visualize the environment mentally, and through symbolic representations by means of language. The non-linguistic thought comes initially by inactive methods or by using mental visualizations. After a child has developed his language, his thoughts are augmented and advanced at a greater pace in terms of symbolic representations. Some scientists do not feel satisfied with either version of language or thought, assuming the initial position, and came up with a third version. The third version stated that the language and thought processes are interdependent. Language is a usual part of the thought process, and it does not concern one's ideas taking importance over another, but both the ideas being equally significant. It's a belief that language and thoughts are mutually dependent at infancy, and as the child grows, they become interlinked. For example, when the child starts speaking, it uses only speech and no thoughts are involved in it. Simultaneously, the child adapts initial stages of logic and reasoning which do not concern language. As the child steps to 2 years of age, the social speech and the initial logical reasoning combine together, and the words represent their symbols for their thoughts. Empirical evidences. According to Piaget, language is just a part of the several symbolic functions. The other functions were symbolic play and imagery. Piaget believes that the relationship of thought and language is the opposite of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. For Piaget, the development of the intellect occupies high priority, and without which language is only significant than a baby's babble. For this purpose, researchers had observed in children who had understood the concept of volume conservation. At this level, the children learn to appreciate the volume of a liquid transferred from one container to another. He found that such kids grasp words such as more, bigger than, and as little as. The children who hadn't been exposed to this concept before found it hard to utilize the words correctly even when provided specific linguistic training. A research study was conducted on the Navajo Indians by Carroll and Casagrade. The 3 groups of participants were ones who spoke Navajo only, those who speak both Navajo and English, and finally American children of European descent who knew only English. The form and shape of things was very important for Navajos, which is incorporated in their language. Several verbs are used for handling long, flexible objects from those used for holding short and rigid objects. The American children establish identifying objects in the sequence such as size, color, form, and shape. If the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was true, the Navajo speaking children would have identified objects at an earlier age than American children. The main source of confusion is which came first, the language or its environment. According to Whorf and Sapir, the language came initially and then the way people perceived it, but it could have been vice versa too. The 92 words for rice species used by the Hunuko people are words that indicate the environment and the things that are of great importance to them. Therefore, it is important to identify what forms of communication and language holds the greatest degree of importance based on the society of origin. It is a known fact that language helps in differentiating the environments of various people and provides tanks to retain the differences in one's memory. The more flexible a language is, the introduction of new terms, jargons are bound to increase. This instance, however, emphasizes that the thought is the father of the language and not the vice versa. There is also a problem which relates to the flexibility of language and the ability of the people to adapt to this flexibility. It is not static, but new terms relating perhaps to new technology or perhaps to the use of jargon are continually being introduced. This seems to indicate that thought is the parent of language rather than the other way round. If thought always was required to indicate the language, there would be no ways to induce fresh thoughts into the process. Change only in the language is not sufficient, but changes a new technology and original thinking shall ignite new thoughts. Thus, the above section has presented evidences of how empirical evidences are conflicting when it comes to facets of language and mind. How do we find out about languages? In the previous sections, we had studied about how people connect their thoughts and language to communicate to others. We had also seen about different ideologies based on this concept. In comparison to the thought process and idea generation, language formation is more sequenced and organized. Language is the only way of communicating with the other individuals and is unique to every culture and society. It is also considered a cultural trademark of a society. Language is both a complicated and a flexible system that encourages innovation, modification, and evolution. It can be put across in different ways, from oral expression, kinetically, and through graphical representations. On the other hand, language plays a major role not only in communication but also helps in determining a particular cultural group and their ethnicity. Language can vary across religion, class, ethnic groups, and levels of education, and across generations. The language that a person speaks and how they communicate gives an idea about their cultural affiliations, how others perceive and socialize with them. Although a person might process his or her thoughts at a rapid pace, translating them into a language or into a form that is understood by all is a tough task. Not necessarily all that is conceived in the mind ought to be expressed orally. With proper exposure to the environment, children tend to develop their language skills over the initial years of their lives. Children usually obtain information about their language from their surroundings, such as parents, caretakers, and the adults around them. Infants generally develop their language by listening, and they are very sensitive to statistical regularities in language and inflections in words. They adapt analogies for coining new words and try to mimic the adult speech. Children have a tendency to choose the nouns, verbs, and adjectives more frequently and develop their range later on. Kids respond to the joint focus of attention for both the adult and the kid, like to what is physical and conversationally existent, and hence to the language directed to them as listeners. Social interaction forms the focus of such acquisition processes. People tend to recognize, categorize, and recall objects and events without even using language. The sorting that people apply to language does not always link to what they do in response to language. People tend to develop into a wholesome way only if they use multiple representations of experience, link them to specific languages for encoding purposes, and also developed their cognition for recognition, sorting, categorization, and recalling. A child's initial conceptual portrayal of objects, relations, and incidents facilitate a strong foundation for linguistic categories and a universal source for languages. Precisely, humans illustrate experiences accumulated from perception inputs with informational inferences in context. In the first year of birth, infants begin to organize what they know about things around them and the incidents they have witnessed before they learn the language. The variations occur only when children learn different languages. This section has given an effective summation of how languages are brought into focus and the role of languages in development. Role of language in development. Languages vary in subtle degrees by the way they are encoded because they arouse ideas and offer people exclusive and systematic maps of the events they have spoken about. The grammatical and phrasal options available in one of the languages do not express all details of the concepts available around in the environment. Words and language generally focus their attention on few entities and do not cover the other entities sufficiently. Each language caters to variety in selection of entities and topics that it would cover. It is generally advisable for children to choose the languages in which the categories should work out. This job treads into adulthood also, as children tend to map each unknown word and construction to relevant concepts and representations in their life. Since languages vary, children who learn several languages tend to link different linguistic forms and structures to their familiar domain to understand the concepts with ease. How they speak about every domain is independent on their language that they often use or hear. Some of these variances can be identified at an earlier stage, and as soon as the kids begin to pick up a language, this characteristic is evident in the domain of space. According to various researches conducted on language learning and a child's ability to differentiate between various sounds, children tend to focus their attention completely on the sounds of a particular language in their growing environment. The kids tend to develop listening skills and try to acquire language from their surroundings between 10 to 14 months, but the capacity to differentiate is not lost completely. Although their capabilities differ, their conceptual differentiations tend to follow a similar pathway. The kids usually pick up differences in the language and then reduce them gradually to those actually demarcated in the language that they hear in day-to-day life. To know how extent does this parallel concept hold? Languages differ in their taxonomy or structure, that is their meanings, grammatical options and the usual patterns used in the words and the structuring. Till what limits do young kids reflect cognitive differentiations that were already existent? Certain questions such as, do children also make further discriminations from adults who speak the same language, and which of the following grammatical differentiations have a conceptual foundation already in place when kids start to learn from them? In the concept of acquiring language, language production lags when compared to comprehension. The researchers rarely verify activities such as, do children really understand certain terms, or they are just making inferences from what speakers or adults mean around them? How do researchers check the alternatives available and the documents with more care when children cope with different forms of language used? Survey findings from development of cognition and comparative psychology state that language may help to establish new links for vision, sense of touch and audio-visual memory also. Therefore, it is established that the role of language in development is important in arriving at both cognitive and behavioral development. The link between language and development is succulent, and if there are problems in some of these patterns of development, then the child may develop mental disorders like autism. In conclusion, I would like to remind you how language and thoughts play a major role in our lives from the infant stage to the adulthood. The various hypotheses brought out the mutual relationship between the thought perception process and language cognition. Although the thought process and linguistic capabilities are different, they are interdependent. Some scientists felt that a person's intellect and brain had to be developed for the person to learn a language. Then we came across the most important fact that language is not only a capability, but it is used as a medium of communication to put across one's ideas across another person. Language is also considered as a cultural unique factor and helps in bonding ethnic groups. The main source of linguistic learning is from the environment. Children tend to learn faster with highly communicative adults and tend to process their thoughts accordingly. It is noted that children lack language production at a younger age and lead to develop better comprehension. The major question here is that to what limit may the language acquisition be responsible for variety in patterns and rates of cognitive and linguistic development? The second question that is asked is, to what limit may such links be impacted by the language amount that children are exposed to? Most scientists and surveys reveal that children tend to respond better to visualizations and mental imagery when taught something in a class. Although languages differ, the person's thought process still remains the same, and the effort to convert one's thoughts to words remains the toughest task. Thank you.